My name is Chandra, and I just turned 27 last month right after graduating from law school. My grandparents raised me more than my parents ever did, and when they passed away, they left me their entire $6 million estate instead of giving it to my father, their only son. After seeing how my family reacted to the inheritance, I made the difficult decision to place everything in a trust. Last week, my parents and sisters showed up at my door with suspicious smiles on their faces. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from and what you would do in my situation. Drop a comment and subscribe if this is your first time here. Looking back, I realize my bond with my grandparents was unusual from the very beginning. While most kids spent weekends with their parents at the park or movies, I was always at Grandma and Grandpa Miller's farmhouse just outside the city. It wasn't that my parents deliberately abandoned me, but they were always preoccupied with their careers and my younger sister, Lisa. Dad worked as a financial advisor at a prestigious firm downtown, often pulling 60-hour weeks and traveling for conferences. Mom managed her own interior design business, constantly meeting clients and attending industry events. They were ambitious people determined to climb the social ladder and maintain a certain lifestyle. Lisa came along when I was 6 and she quickly became the center of attention. She was the baby, the one who needed extra care and supervision. I was already the quiet, independent child who could entertain herself with books and imagination. It wasn't hard for my parents to justify leaving me with my grandparents while they focused on work. And Lisa, Grandpa Miller, my father's father, was a retired investment banker who had built his wealth through smart decisions and careful planning. He lived with Grandma in a sprawling farmhouse with 10 acres of land, complete with apple trees and a small pond for fishing. Their home became my sanctuary, my true home in many ways. Every Saturday morning, Grandma would wake me up with the smell of homemade cinnamon rolls wafting through the house. We would bake together, her patient hands guiding mine as I learned to measure flour and crack eggs. She was nothing like my mother, who preferred catered parties to cooking at home. Grandma believed in creating things with your own hands, in putting love into everyday activities. Grandpa taught me how to fish, setting up 2 chairs by the pond and explaining the value of patience. As we waited for the fish to bite, he would tell me stories about his own childhood, about the Great Depression his parents had lived through, about the importance of saving and planning for the future. When I was 9, Grandpa started teaching me about money in ways I could understand. He set up a small investment account for me, adding $20 each month and showing me how it grew over time. We would track the progress together, calculating interest and discussing basic economic principles. I soaked it all up like a sponge. My grandmother focused on teaching me different values. She emphasized honesty, integrity, and responsibility. She always said, money can buy comfort, Chandra, but it can't buy character. You build that yourself, one decision at a time. Our evenings often involved sitting in their cozy living room, reading books together or playing board games. Sometimes Grandpa would tune in to financial news, explaining concepts to me in simple terms. The foundations of my understanding of money, wealth, and responsibility were laid during these moments. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents grew increasingly distant. When I did spend time at home, Dad was usually locked in his office or glued to his phone. Mom flitted from one social engagement to another, often leaving me with babysitters even when she wasn't working. Lisa became accustomed to being the center of attention, throwing tantrums when she didn't get her way, which seemed to work remarkably well with my parents. As I grew older, I began to notice subtle tensions during family gatherings, when my father would mention some expensive purchase or investment opportunity. Grandpa would exchange knowing glances with Grandma. Once I overheard them discussing my father after a Thanksgiving dinner. "I worry about Jeffrey's spending habits," Grandpa said quietly. "He seems to think money grows on trees. Your son lives beyond his means," Grandma replied with a sigh. I was 13 when Grandpa took me aside one summer afternoon. We were sitting by the pond, fishing rods cast into the water, when he said something I would never forget. Chandra, I want you to know that your grandmother and I have plans in place to secure your future. We see how smart and responsible you're becoming, and we want to make sure you have every opportunity to succeed. I didn't fully understand the implications at the time, but I felt the weight of his words, the trust they were placing. In me, the farmhouse became even more of a haven during my teenage years. While my peers were dealing with high school drama and social pressure, I spent weekends helping Grandpa maintain the property or assisting Grandma with her elaborate garden. They encouraged my academic interests, celebrated my achievements, and provided the emotional support I rarely received at home. When I was accepted to college with a partial scholarship, my grandparents insisted on covering the remaining costs. They attended my orientation while my parents sent a gift card with their regrets, citing a business conference they couldn't miss. By this point, the pattern was well established. My sister Lisa, now a teenager herself, had grown into someone I barely knew. She was popular, social, and remarkably similar to our parents in her materialistic outlook. Our conversations were superficial when they happened at all. My grandparents continued to be my rock, my foundation. They never criticized my parents directly to me, never tried to turn me against them. Instead, they focused on building me up, on helping me become the best version of myself. Every summer and holiday break, I returned to their farm, finding peace in the familiar routines and unconditional love they provided. Looking back now, I can see how they were preparing me for a future they had already envisioned. They were investing in me, not just financially but emotionally and intellectually. They were raising me to understand the true value of wealth, to see beyond the material trappings that seemed to consume my parents' lives, and I was learning, growing stronger in my convictions, developing the sense of responsibility that would eventually lead me to make the hardest decision of my life. Everything changed during my senior year of college. I was deep into finals week when I got the call from my mother. Her voice was flat, emotionless, as she delivered the news that Grandpa had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. I remember sitting in my dorm room, phone clutched in my hand, unable to process what had heard. Grandpa, with his booming laugh and endless wisdom, was suddenly gone. The world tilted on its axis. The funeral was held 3 days later. I arrived at the farmhouse to find it filled with people I barely recognized, distant relatives and business associates. My father was shaking hands and accepting condolences with a somber expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. My mother stood beside him, perfectly dressed in black, her makeup impeccable despite the occasion. Lisa, now 17, seemed bored and kept checking her phone when she thought no one was looking. I felt like I was watching actors in a play, going through the motions of grief without feeling it. Grandma was different. Her pain was palpable, raw, and real in a way that made my heart break all over again. Yet she carried herself with dignity, receiving guests with quiet grace. When our eyes met across the room, I saw a flash of relief in hers. "I am so glad you're here," she whispered when I finally reached her side. After the funeral, as people mingled over catered food in the farmhouse, I overheard my father talking to his cousin in the hallway. "Dad was always conservative with his money," he said, loosening his tie. "That farm and the investments, it's got to be worth a few million at least. Once Mom settles in somewhere smaller, we'll have to figure out what to do with everything." His casual planning, the assumption that Grandpa's death meant access to wealth, made my stomach turn. I walked away before I could hear more. Grandma asked me to stay with her after everyone left, and I gladly agreed. We spent evenings looking through old photo albums, sharing memories of Grandpa. She seemed to be agging before my eyes, her grief etching new lines on her face. 3 months later, Grandma was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months, but she barely lasted 3. It was as if without Grandpa, her will to live had diminished. She died peacefully in her sleep, holding my hand. The second funeral was smaller, more intimate. I felt numb, hollowed out by grief. In just a few months, ID lost the 2 people who had been my true north, my guiding stars, the 2 people who had loved me unconditionally. After the service, we gathered at the family lawyer's office for the reading of the will. Mr. Gladwell, who had handled my grandparents' legal affairs for decades, looked solemn as he prepared to read the documents. My father sat forward in his chair, expectant, my mother perched beside him, her expression carefully neutral. Lisa twirled a strand of hair around her finger, clearly wishing she was elsewhere. Mr. Gladwell cleared his throat. To my son Jeffrey and his wife Patricia, I leave my collection of first edition books and the family photo albums, the rest of my estate including the farmhouse, all investments, bank accounts and personal belongings, I leave to my granddaughter Chandra, with the hope that she will use these resources wisely and in keeping with the values we have tried to instill in her. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face flushed crimson. $6 million, he finally sputtered. All of it to Chandra. I am their only son. My mother turned to me, her eyes cold. What did you do? She demanded. How did you manipulate them into this? Lisa laughed bitterly. Of course, perfect Chandra gets everything. It's always been about her. I sat there stunned by both the inheritance and my family's reaction. Mr. Gladwell handed me a sealed envelope. Your grandmother asked that you read this privately, he said. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. My father had stormed out of the lawyer's office, my mother trailing behind him. Lisa had shot me a look of pure hatred before following them. I was alone with my thoughts and the envelope clutched in my hand. Inside was a letter, written in Grandma's neat script. Dearest Chandra, if you're reading this, both your grandfather and I have left this world. Please know that our decision to leave our estate to you wasn't made lightly or without careful consideration.